Greetings, World Regional Geography students. Welcome back from spring break. I am going to do an exam review covering the material that we had for the most recent section of the course. And I wanted to, first of all, just remind you all that geography is interested and directed towards the spatial study of both physical and human phenomena on the Earth's surface. We're interested in connections, we're interested in the distribution, the geographic spread of these various aspects of both Earth's natural systems and the human communities and human landscapes that are draped over the top of these physical landscapes. And so with that lead-in, I will remind you that you will have a study guide that has terms and concepts and a discussion this week that will allow us to interact with the classmates and with your instructor to further investigate and discuss some of the various topics that have been addressed in this section of the course by way of preparing you for the exam. So we're going to start off with Middle America, and Middle America is a realm that is considered to be fragmented, both in terms of its physical geography, but also from a political standpoint. And what this means is that it's broken up into various physical entities. Of course, we have the land bridge connecting North and South America. We've got the Great Funnel of Mexico that extends northward towards and into North America. And then we've got the archipelago of islands that extends through the Caribbean Sea. And so those are very much fragmented. But we also have various political fragmentation, a lot of political unrest that is characteristic of the region. We have a very strong Amerindian and colonial legacy in this realm. And we also have a history of conflict and corruption, including intervention from not only the historical European colonial powers, but from the United States as well. We see a heavy dependence on primary sector economic activities. You see a coffee farmer in the image here. That's a characteristic primary sector activity, mining, logging, and this is going to be characteristic of areas that have high degrees of poverty, indeed persistent poverty, one of the defining characteristics of this realm. Okay, so from a physiographic, tectonic standpoint, the process of subduction that we've learned about, especially in the context of the west coast of North America, north of Cape Mendocino in California, the Great Cascadia Subduction Zone. Similar process going on, so this process of one plate plunging beneath another is going to be what constructed the Isthmus of Panama, the land bridge, and is going to result in both volcanic activity and also earthquake activity. This produces, especially on the mainland, a mountainous terrain that is going to be characterized by vertical or elevational zones of climate, vegetation, and also will end up determining agricultural practices. So you can see the types of crops, the types of natural plants that would occur at these different elevations. Okay, of course, the colonial influence in this realm is going to be an important topic, but when Europeans arrived, they discovered very advanced civilizations, namely the Aztecs and the Mayans. And among the contributions that these cultures brought were foods that transformed world diets. And so the colonial influences, therefore, not only affected the native populations through things like colonialism and systems of government and whatnot, but also we see this exchange of culture going back And so this is an example of transculturation. Of course, in this region, we see a lot of mixed ethnicity. This is given the name mestizo. This was actually intentional on the part of the Spanish colonizers to mix with the natives, making Catholicism and also the various aspects of Spanish culture more ingrained within the local populations. Here we see the areas that were colonized by various European countries. Of course, Spain is going to have the greatest impact, but you can see they were not alone. It is worth noting that the colonial spheres here focus on the Caribbean. This is where plantation agriculture for export was most dramatically undertaken. This is where we see the import of slaves. And we also see a lot of the resulting cultures to this day as a product of this. Land alienation, another product of this colonial system. Today we see widespread deforestation in Central America, and this is particularly tragic in the context of these tropical forests that are homes for a very high degree of biological diversity. Okay, as mentioned earlier, we see a lot of persistent poverty in this region. Of course, this has created a motivation for migrants to cross the border into North America. But one of the big impacts that we've seen in recent decades is the development of the North American Free Trade Agreement and the resulting maquiladoras that have been constructed along the border region, with a variety of impacts to the populations of Mexico and the United States, to economics in terms of jobs being available, but also products in the United States, and also environmental impacts as well, all affecting the border region. Moving into South America, again, we see a tremendous contribution to world cultures and world civilizations within this realm, most notably the Incans and these great ruins that we see in places like Machu Picchu, which is seen in the image. It's worth noting that there were as many as 1 million indigenous peoples that also lived within the Amazon basin, although they left very little trace, in particular because they were constructing out of wood in an environment that decomposes virtually everything that is living or once living. Physiographically, the Andes are going to dominate from north to south along the western border of the continent. Again, subduction is the process by which we see this these mountains formed, but we also have the great Amazon basin, and then, of course, a number of highlands like the Guiana highlands and the Brazilian highlands. Population is going to be concentrated along the margins of the continent rather than in the interior. We have great cities from Buenos Aires to Sao Paulo and Caracas that are found along the eastern and northeastern coastlines, again, in part relating back to the original colonization from Europe across the Atlantic Ocean. Cultural pluralism is another defining characteristic, where we have not one single dominant culture, but most countries having significant minorities of multiple populations, be they European, Amerindian, Mestizo, African, in some cases Japanese and East Indian, making up significant parts of the population. Okay, so again, you'll notice that these characteristic Andean volcanoes are going to resemble those that are found in the Cascades. Of course, the Amazon basin, the greatest geographic extent of tropical rainforest in the world, hosts remarkable diversity of species, many of which have yet to be discovered. And what we are witnessing is a dramatic removal of this great forest land and the species associated with this. There's a variety of factors that are driving this, from poor peasants that are being given land to large multinational agricultural interests and mining interests that are driving the cutting down of these great forests. South America is interesting for a number of different reasons, including this unique split where we see this historic line, the Tordesillas line that separates the Portuguese from Spanish colonial holdings. Of course, eventually the Portuguese would come to dominate all of Brazil, which is one of the top 5 countries in the world in both population and its geographic area. Spanish originally coming in through the Caribbean and down through the west coast. I'm going to back up and just make a comment here on this particular slide, which is that to this day what we'll find is that in the more temperate parts of the continent, similar to in Africa, we see a more dominant European presence. So in South America, that's going to be in in Argentina and Chile, we'll see the most significant European populations. Indeed, this is called the European cone. When we get up into the Andes, we will see the remnants of the once great Incan Empire and a very large Amerindian population. You'll see significant Amerindian populations in the Amazon as well. And then in the north, what we'll find is more of an African descendant population, and that actually includes all the way along the coast down to the great cities of Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And this is the result of the slave trade and the plantations that were established along this coastline. Tourism, of course, is something that is affecting most parts of the globe and can have very positive effects and negative effects as well. The infusion of foreign dollars, the sort of recognition and honoring of the unique cultures and places of these countries in which tourists are coming to, can all be positive, but these can also have drawbacks, especially when you see a sole focus on tourism. If something happens that interrupts the tourist trade, this will have a significant disruption to the economy, and it can also have disturbing effects on local culture as well. Okay, next up we're going to talk about North Africa and Southwest Asia. As this opening slide implies, this is a land of great contrast, including some very traditional societies and also some very modern areas as well, especially those that have received the benefits of the petroleum or oil extraction that has taken place within the region. This, of course, is also a region of great conflict, and so we will be talking about that as well. This slide pokes fun at the contrast between East and West, and also hints at a certain note of reality, which is a sort of misunderstanding about the nature of our respective cultures. If we look at a regional realm-wide map, we see that there are actually each of the colored areas represent different regions of the realm, and those include the Maghreb and its neighbors, Egypt and the Lower Nile Basin, the Middle East, the Empire States, and Turkestan, and finally the African Transition Zone. This is a vast realm with a high degree of variability in terms of its cultures, in terms of its physical landscapes, but it is unified, among other things, by its dry and arid climates and by the adherence to Islam, which is dominant throughout the realm. Your arid and semi-arid climates, the term steppe is in reference to these great grasslands that are found throughout Central Asia. You see the Central Asian antelope in the picture, in contrast to the true deserts that you see characterized in the upper right. Remember that deserts broadly occur in two places in the world. One is along the belt of the subtropic high pressure cell. High pressure in the atmosphere results in a lack of rainfall, but also in the rain shadow of large mountains. Sorry, my slide cuts off here. Pastoralism is the term that's shown here, and it refers to the tending of herds of livestock and bringing them to feed and water where it is available. And so that is going to be a characteristic of this particular part of the world. Again, most of us have heard the stories in the news about terrorism, and this is going to be associated with this process of religious revivalism or fundamentalism. This is a very strict adherence, oftentimes many would argue a misinterpretation of the Gospels of the religion. It is important to note that this is a minority of the population, that most Muslims have much more moderate views than those that are espoused by fundamentalists in these countries. Okay, this is a geographic process that is used in reference to a wide array of subject matter, including disease, but also culture, in this case religion. You can see the origin of Islam and its spread. This region is home to some of the great culture hearths of the world in terms of our history, including the Fertile Crescent and the Nile Valley. Great contributions and innovations, including the first cities and the first agriculture, is traced to this realm. So a little bit about the various countries that have been the focus of conflict. Of course, Iraq, something we've all had in our news in recent years as a result of the now 15-year-old war that the United States has engaged in this part of the world. It's worth noting that the Shiite sect of Islam, which is aligns to those of Iran, are currently those that are in control of the government. The rebel groups such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS are Sunni Muslims. Syria's ongoing war, as we heard, is the source of a refugee crisis, a humanitarian crisis, and is a global geopolitical concern with the United States, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and others, Iran, all involved in, to some degree or another. Iran has been an enemy of the United States since the overthrow in 1979. This is a religious state, but one that has significant parts of its population that are much more moderate than their government might imply. Again, I've mentioned this before. If you're talking about this region, the two sort of counterbalancing powers are Iran, the Shiite state, and Saudi Arabia, the Sunni state. The discovery of oil in the 1930s was a major reason that colonial powers such as Britain initially got involved in this part of the world, and has been a reason for a variety of the outside intervention. Certainly the United States interest in the region partly traced to oil. Okay, North Africa, this is the site of the Arab Spring uprisings that led to the overthrow of long-standing dictators in Egypt and Libya. Today we see a lot of unrest in these places, in particular Libya, which is effectively a failed state. Okay, as you look at the transition zone, you'll notice that Islam begins to taper off significantly as we extend south and across the Sahara Desert. We'll be moving into talking about sub-Saharan Africa, but it's worth noting that desertification is a process of land degradation that's affecting much of the realm of Southwest Asia, North Africa, and sub-Saharan Africa. Note that the true deserts of Saudi Arabia and the Sahara are not included here because they cannot be desertified. They are already deserts. Desertification is a process of land degradation. You note how the area immediately to the south of the Sahara is particularly vulnerable. This is the area known as the Sahel. Africa is a vast continent. It is a continent that you could store the countries of China, the United States, much of Western Europe within its boundaries. And it is, of course, the continent that was the origin of modern humans. Homo sapiens developed in this area by the best understanding about 200,000 years ago, and did not leave the African continent before roughly 70,000 years ago. So, stated another way, at least 3/4 of human history played out on the African continent. This has been called the plateau continent. We see a process known as rifting, in which the continent is being pulled apart effectively. This has opened up the Red Sea and has created this system of Great Lakes. And so we'll see volcanic activity, the two great volcanoes shown here, all within this region of East Africa. And East Africa is home to the Great Rift Valley, which is the cradle of humanity. The tropical savanna biome is going to be the signature biome of Africa, and one that supports this great array of wildlife, many of which are now at risk as a result of poaching, habitat loss, and a variety of other factors. This is among the most culturally, ethnically diverse places in the world, partly traced to the extremely long history. We see all of these different languages represented, language families represented, and this is connects to both the potential of Africa and also the challenges that Africa faces. You still have certain tribalism that has led to a lot of the conflict that we've heard about, but more importantly, the colonial history that disrupted, created land alienation and other problems, certainly a major factor for the problems, but in diversity lies strength, and so this diversity also presents great potential as well. We do have hearths, especially those in West Africa, that have influenced much of the rest of the continent. I mentioned colonialism. No place did the system of European colonialism reach such a vast extent. In 1888, the European powers effectively carved up the entire continent, hence the term the scramble for Africa, and many of these countries did not receive independence until the 1970s. Okay, health geography is a theme in this section, and you can see the number of people that were affected by natural disasters. We also see a variety of other disease issues. You learned about pandemic, epidemic, and endemic diseases, each of which have a unique meaning in terms of how they affect the population. But we've gradually seen improvements, and so this is one of the things that offers a certain potential for Africa moving forward. The story of Darfur in the country of Sudan is a tragic one, and one that has received far too little attention from the world community. And it does illustrate broader problems that affect not only sub-Saharan Africa, but the stability of our world. So as we wrap up this section on Africa, I wanted to just point out a couple of things. I'm going to get myself back to a slide of Africa just for discussion's sake. And just to remind you that Africa does have, in spite of generally poor agricultural soils and generally inconsistent rainfall, poor access to ports, and navigable rivers, they do have significant mineral and energy resources. They have a young working age population, and they have stabilizing governments. And because they have cheap labor and resources, there's been a lot of foreign investment, most notably from China, but also from India and Europe, less so from the United States. And population and health indicators continue to improve. The adoption of new technologies, all of these things bode well for lifting sub-Saharan Africa out of its position as the poorest realm in the world. So that will be the conclusion of my brief summary of topics for exam 1. Excuse me, this is exam 2. and we will see you online for the discussion.